Coming up, this week in Brexit. More than 2 years after the end of the transition period, which saw the UK leaving the European Union, each week sees more Brexit bad news stories arriving thick and fast. No wonder that aggregate poll trackers show an ever-increasing majority of the British public now believe the vote for Brexit to have been wrong. And I can think of stronger words for a question than wrong that these polls could have used. Stupid? Xenophobic? Misrepresented? Those just for a start. Add your own favourites in the comments below. But first, stay tuned for a roundup of this week's Brexit bad news. If you enjoy watching the Truth to Power channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe, and above all, share a link to this video with your friends and social media contacts. On Sunday this week, the Huffington Post reported the following story. Chinese car maker rules out UK factory because of Brexit. Warren Buffett-backed Chinese company BYD, Build Your Dreams, are the world's largest seller of electric and hybrid cars, and their European president, Michael Hsu, ruled out building its first European factory in the UK this week, blaming it squarely on the uncertainty caused by Brexit, saying that Britain hadn't even made it onto the long list of 10. Hsu told the Financial Times, "As an investor, we want a country to be stable. To open a factory is a decision for decades. Without Brexit, maybe, but after Brexit, we don't understand what happened." The UK has struggled to attract investment from electric vehicle companies ever since Brexit, with Tesla also citing Brexit for its decision to bypass the UK in favour of Germany. Several established car makers in the UK are also facing crucial decisions over their plants this year. And of course, UK battery startup British Volt, which had planned to build a giant factory to make electric car batteries in Blyth, Northumberland, collapsed earlier this year as it struggled to turn a profit and ran out of money. A bit of a post-Brexit theme emerging here, isn't there? Instead of post-Brexit Britain, BYD are looking to build a factory to produce 800,000 cars a year in Germany, Spain, Poland, Hungary, or France, interestingly enough, after French President Emmanuel Macron hit out at the consequences of Brexit while standing next to Rishi Sunak at their summit the week before. The French president said the effects of quitting the EU had been underestimated before the 2016 referendum. On Monday this week, the BBC reported a new Brexit story relating to money from the European Social Fund, which is due to cease at the end of this month as a result of Brexit. The ESF has until now provided about £40 million a year to community and charity groups in Northern Ireland alone, where there are about 17,000 beneficiaries, amongst the most vulnerable in society. The decision not to replace EU funding until as late as 2024 was made by Michael Gove's Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, the DLUHC, who have claimed that a new fund, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, will, at a minimum, match previous EU funding. Eventually. Sounds like they're trying to push a decision beyond the next general election. On Tuesday, Reuters published an article ostensibly about the Downton Abbey castle halting weddings due to Brexit, but it used the opportunity to give a really useful review of the current state of post-Brexit Britain. Highclere Castle in southern England is facing a serious staffing crunch, said Reuters. Apparently, the reason is the dearth of workers from the European Union, which has forced owner Fiona Carnarvon to mothball the castle's main business of hosting large weddings. Since Brexit, there are no staff, she said. Reuters reported that this staffing challenge illustrates the still unfolding impacts of Brexit on Britain's labour market 3 years after the UK's departure from the European Union. Its biggest trading partner, Reuters helpfully points out. A vital workforce of EU students attending university in Britain who were available to work in casual and part-time jobs is now no longer available. According to University Admissions Service UCAS, the number of EU students admitted to British universities fell 50% in 2021, partly due to uncertainty created by Brexit. But as regular viewers of this channel will know, that lost student workforce is only part of the labour market problems post-Brexit Britain has suffered. Since leaving the EU, we've had worker shortages at various stages in manufacturing, healthcare, construction, logistics, agriculture and hospitality, and most of these sectors are still struggling to fill vacancies today. And although business is pushing the government to relax its tough post-Brexit immigration rules, the hard right wing of Rishi Sunak's Tory party won't allow him to tone down the anti-immigrant rhetoric, as it's a central plank of their culture wars strategy to win the next election. Although, as last week's Gary Lineker fiasco backfired badly on the government, with polls showing a 4% decrease in support for the Tories compared to the week before, it's good to see that they've lost their latest battle in a war that's in reality only being fought from their side. For the rest of us, the culture war is an entirely confected edifice designed to distract the electorate from the more important issues of the cost of living, civil and employment rights, and the gradual redistribution of wealth from the very poorest to the very richest. The latest move being Jeremy Hunt's budget this week, handing out further tax breaks on pensions, benefiting only the very richest in society, with even the Daily Mail reporting that there was fury at massive tax loophole for the rich. But back to Brexit. And also on Tuesday, the newspaper carried an article headed "Brexit Bonfire of EU Laws Could Let Water Companies Conceal Sewage Discharges," campaigners warn. Apparently, a law that forces water companies to hand over data to campaigners could be scrapped under rees-mogg's legislation for a bonfire of European regulations, the Retained EU Law Bill. One of the 2,000 laws that could be chucked onto the bonfire is the Environmental Information Regulations 2004, which give the public the right to request information and data on environmental issues such as how much sewage pollution is going on. These regulations have been used by loads of organisations to scrutinise water companies, and campaigners are up in arms about this so-called Brexit benefit. Like most of the regulations to be junked by default at the end of this year, the Environmental Information Regulations come under the remit of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. Most of this so-called retained EU law sets minimum standards for food and the environment that this Tory government seems desperate not to be bound by so they can maximise profits for their chums and cronies in the privatised water companies at the expense of the environment and the public. DEFRA ministers Therese Coffey and Mark Spencer have refused to commit to keeping legislation that underpins the environmental protection of Britain's rivers. It's a disgrace, and it's all in the name of Brexit. We're still only up to Tuesday, and perhaps my favourite Brexit story of the week. As the Brexitists never tire of telling us, Brexit gives the UK the right to set its own regulatory standards. In practice, and predictably, companies appear to be pretty much manufacturing to a higher EU standard anyway to protect their access to that market. This phenomenon is already being referred to as the Brussels effect, where British companies adopt EU standards throughout their businesses, reflecting the size of the EU market relative to Britain and the relative strictness of its standards. Anyway, the BBC have reported that a new EU rule is reducing the permitted level of arsenic in baby food. They highlight that the Windsor framework allows GB-produced baby foods with higher arsenic residues than the EU permits to still be eligible for sale in Northern Ireland. Yet another Brexit benefit. Not only Britain, but Northern Ireland now have the Brexit freedom to have higher levels of arsenic in our baby food. Yum yum. But in practice, despite the wet dreams of the Brexitists, UK companies are likely to follow the EU regulations rather than the lower British standards. The BBC article points out that this raises a wider issue about how UK manufacturers, particularly exporters, will react to regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU. The fact is, as I've already said, that however much this government seemed determined to diverge from EU standards, it's in the commercial interest of companies in Britain to maintain equivalence in order to continue to sell their products into the EU. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. In other words, Despite Brexit, most British companies are still behaving as though they are still bound by EU standards. On Wednesday, we had the budget, which would be a subject for a whole Truth to Power video by itself, so I just want to pick out the most Brexity elements of it, and in particular, the response of the SNP's Stuart Hosey, of whom I'm a huge fan following his sterling work on the Intelligence and Security Committee and their Russia report, labelling Russian interference in UK politics as the new normal. Brexit slammed the brake on UK investment, he said, adding that the UK economy was one of the weakest in the G7. He told the Commons, being outside the EU single market remains a drag on the ability of firms to trade easily with our nearest neighbours because of the unilaterally imposed trade barriers brought in by the UK's exit from the European Union. The financial news website FN London carried this story on the budget and Brexit. Spring Budget 2023, City left hanging on Brexit questions. They noted that a whole host of issues arising from the UK's departure from the EU are still unsolved after the latest budget, with lingering questions remaining about the UK's financial services sector and a regulatory deal with the EU. Nigel Farage, remember him? Identified a major Brexit win in the budget on his sad little show on GBBs that attracts less viewers than the average Truth to Power YouTube video. The Brexit pubs guarantee, he claims, takes advantage of a new tax flexibility since leaving the European Union. The measure, he says, will see duty on draft pints a few pennies lower in pubs than in supermarkets, although drinkers will still see tax on beer and other alcohol served in pubs soar from August anyhow, as will alcohol from supermarkets, because of the link between inflation and duty on alcohol. I won't make a habit of it, but I did look at the tabloids again this week, and I'm pretty glad I did. The Daily Express reaction to the Jeremy Hunt budget was succinct and probably better than I could have put it myself. The size of the economy is still forecast to shrink this year. Living standards are the worst on record, and the tax burden remains on course to be the highest since the Second World War. And that from the Toryest of all Tory papers. I would only add that all these things have been made significantly worse by a certain decision taken by an uninformed and misled electorate back in 2016.
Welcome to the Brexit, sir. I'm sorry.
Oh my God.